department. And together with my colleague Stuart Comer, the chief curator, and Thomas J. Lux, the associate curator at the Media and Performance Art Department, we decided to continue the tradition of the Performance Forum initiated by Klaus Biesenbach and Jenny Schlenska, who is here with us tonight. We thought that it would be important to continue this platform for discussion, to engage in what for us is something that we confront on a daily basis, different thoughts, ideas, challenges, doubts, problems related to performance in media. And we decided to have three in this season. This is the first one. The second one will be in winter, dedicated to the formats of representation. And the third one in spring, about the relationship of lens-based media and live art. So archives, a lot has been said about archives, a lot has been written about archives, but we thought it was important to keep on talking about archives. And it's particularly importance has given to the archives in the last 2 decades, if you think about the visual art practices, and also if we think about archives in the means in which historical knowledge and forms of remembrance are accumulated, stored, and recovered. Created by state organization, art institutions, individuals, or groups, the archive constitutes the repository of ordered system of documents and records, foundation from which history is written. And of course, we cannot not mention at least the archive impulse, and we have Holt Foster here with us, Okwe Mvezori Archive Fever, Derrida Archive Fever, and many other important writings about the archive in the last 20 years. So we wanted to bring somehow the discussion further and thinking about archiving movement, gesture, dance, and of different way of conceiving their archives, of like define them, redefine them, examine them, and thinking what constitutes an archive. So the first series is sorry, I have a clicker right here. The first series is Storytelling in the Archive. And we sent this email with this image of the Boris Charmatz flip book that we performed exactly 2 years ago here at MoMA, and we'll talk more about that later. And then we sent those 5 questions. Of course, we could spend not just one session, we could spend all year talking about those 5 questions. So what I will do, it's like really shortly go through 3 questions to let you also have an idea what we in the department think and discuss. So, can we archive gesture and movement, and for what future? I would like at this occasion to mention the conference that we had the opportunity, the pleasure to host, organized by Andre Lepecki and Adrian Hitfield, who's also here with us, which was Afterlives, the Persistent of Performance, and was focused on the ongoing life of performance, because we usually always talk about performance as something ephemeral, as something that disappeared, but what was really great in the conference that we were talking about performance of the recurrence of performance, and particularly the traces, how the performance, how the event linger in the memory, in the oral history, in the teaching, or as Andre and Adrian call it, the infrastructure of feeling. So thinking how do you capture dance, how do you capture experience. Cori Olinghouse, who is the director of the Trisha Brown Dance Company Archive, is doing an amazing job, and she will talk more about it. The second question, what pressures do archives place on cultural forms that welcome disappearance or oblivion, such as non-verbal forms of communication, dance, or performance? And here, of course, we should not think dance only as an activity, but something that includes questions, participation, relations, and objects that somehow rethink the material of performance, and particularly the relationship to the object, and what my colleague Thomas Lux said, like the revenge on the object and the subject. And in this extent, we can think about the Walid Rad show at the 3rd floor. When you enter, there is those objects, there's like a riot of objects on their way to Dubai, from the Louvre to Dubai. So in how do we tell the story of objects? And Marvin Taylor, the director of the Fales Library, has a lot to say about that, particularly through the David Wojnarowicz archive. The third one, and the last one, what kinds of narratives and stories emerge for an extended time in the choreographer's archive? So archive, we think about the archive as a physical space. We think about the archive as an imaginative space, so like a geographical and metaphorical space, a source for thinking. So if also the photo that I mentioned, Boris Charmatz's flip book that is taking David Vaughan's archive of Merce Cunningham, it's a way of thinking about that. Of Trajal Harel, a choreographer who is doing a residency here at MoMA, he's talking about fictional archiving of Tatsumi Hijikata's archives. So this idea of the fictional archives, of course, I can't not mention Walid Rad, and again, he's the Atlas Group and the work he did it, and unfortunately, he's not here with us today because he's teaching on Tuesdays. So the whole idea, of course, of the history of the fact how the documents and facts are not intrinsically truth-telling. So there is no really true history. So the narration is important, and what narration are we saying, and what is the best narration. And all the three guests has a very particular and personal way in approaching, studying, and processing the archives. And I will introduce you with my big pleasure. So Marvin Taylor, who is the director of the Fales Library at NYU. It's a figure who is very familiar to many curators, scholars, and students, all of us who visited very often the library. In 1993, he founded the Downtown Collection, which I think it's really one of the most significant archive in that sense, and he will tell us more about that. And he, before being the director of the Fales Library, he was also at the Indiana University Lilly Library and the Rare Book and Manuscript Library and the Health Science Library, both at Columbia. Cori Olinghouse, who is bit of a choreography. She's the director, as I mentioned before, of the Trisha Brown Dance Company, of the archive of the Trisha Brown Dance Company, and she danced herself in the company from 2002 to 2006. From 2001 to 2008, she worked with the esteemed archivist John Gartenberg, who is also here with us tonight. And she also began working as a archival consultant with New York choreographer Kathy Weiss, preserving and documenting over 1,000 moving images and material. Then in 2009, she became director of the Trisha Brown Dance Company, leading cataloging and preservation initiative to archive the Trisha Brown's over. And Boris Charmatz, who is here from Europe, let's say, I don't know which country exactly, but he came from. So it's a French choreographer and dancer, and also director of Musée de la Danse, the dancing museum in Rennes in Brittany, in France. And he is a choreographer who studied at the Paris Opera, but started to work choreographic work in the 90s, collaborating with many artists, and also creating sites for dance, like a school, an association. And from 2009, he was appointed the director of the Centre National de la Danse that he renamed Musée de la Danse, the dancing museum. And we had, exactly 2 years ago, we invited Musée de la Danse with 3 projects. It was called Free Collective Gestures. And recently they took up the Tate with What If Tate was Musée de la Danse. So maybe my introduction was a bit longer, but I thought it was also important to tell you what we think and how we thought that. And this is called Performance Forum, so nomen est omen. Even if the setup, it is a bit ex cathedra, it was really difficult to make it differently because of the lamps. The lamps are like really closing the view, so we had to be a bit up. That's why strategically we put the drinks over there, the food is here, the restroom is here, and of course there's so much expertise in the room that I almost feel intimidated, and I would really encourage you to participate like as soon as our guests will finish their presentation. Thank you very much, and we start with Marvin.
Thank you very much, Ana.
And Marvin, I would like to thank my colleague Marta, Joseph, Swagato, and Bethany who helped organizing this, and the library, of course. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank everybody here at MoMA for inviting me to talk about downtown. Is this on? Okay, very good, thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Downtown Collection and where I think we're going in terms of acquiring materials about performance, largely writ, and tell a few horror stories along the way. And I won't mention the one about how I got there too late to acquire Richard Schechner's materials, which aren't at NYU, and I wish they were. Yeah, sadly. Oh, I know. So normally I open this presentation with some footage from the Judson Memorial Dance collection. and specifically a performance from 1970 of Trio A that was a part of the flag show, the People's Flag Show, which exists only because some crazy local news company came and shot a quarter-inch or half-inch open reel video of the performance that included Trisha Brown and David Gordon and Steve Paxton and everybody in Grand Union, nude except for having flags tied around their necks. And so this was obviously going to be to get Judson into trouble, so they thought that they would tape it. One congregate managed to have that transferred, somehow got a copy of it and transferred it to VHS in the 80s. It's the only documentation we have of this particular performance, for which Reverend Moody and several other performers and artists in the show were jailed for obscenity, how things have changed. So instead, I'm showing this wonderful photo of Rauschenberg and the whole gang performing from the early 60s. And there's the information about Trio A. We do have this, we've preserved it, it's really quite spectacular. Just to mention, we have over 100,000 media items in the collection now, and none of them were produced and distributed, so this is all raw documentation of performance. And we think of performance largely writ. I was talking to students today about our papyrus collection and talking about how they perform for us. I'm calling this talk "The Audience is the Archive," and I'm stealing this from Stuart Comer, who so brilliantly had a series of panels where he screened avant-garde film and brought people in who had been involved with the film so that new generations could experience the work and have an embodied practice and understanding of what was going on. This radically changed how I began to think about what we do as archivists and what we should be doing and what are the potentials given digital technology. I'm not a complete Luddite. I actually like digital technology when it's useful, but today I was handling incunabula and papyri, and somehow the digital image just isn't the same. That may be different for documenting dance. 10 years ago, Rick Reinhardt in the Variable Media Approach said that there's no longer one monolithic original artifact. There is no longer one silver-jacketed preservation method. Instead, we need a layered preservation strategy that admits the fragments, traces, emulation software, recreation, reassemblage. And he's just talking about media art here. But I think this is much more broadly applicable to completely rethinking how we archive, document, and preserve cultural artifacts in general. And this is something we've tried to practice at Fales because artists don't work like literary people and like the great men of history. Their collections are a lot messier, and the means that we have to preserve them in the traditions don't work. So this was 10 years ago, and I've been trying, this isn't a slide for all of you here, this is a slide for my colleagues in the archive world who still haven't quite caught on that this is really, really important, and we need to take on the challenges of video and artifacts and other things, costumes. We need, and where are we going? It's a good question. There are clearly new areas for special collections. We're collecting electronic media like crazy. Every collection that comes in has electronic media in it. We can no longer just pretend that it doesn't. We're acquiring born digital materials hand over fist, and many of you probably heard, and I'm really honored to report that Triple Canopy is going to be working with us to donate their collection to the Fales. And it's going to be a joint project because they've pushed the limits of what you can do with the technology, well beyond what the preservation people in the born digital world have come up with. So, and I know Peter is here tonight. Thank you, Peter, again. This is a huge project for us, and it's really an exciting way to move forward. We've begun crowdsourcing collections, especially for downtown when people have passed away and the material was never gathered. So we've crowdsourced together Dean Johnson's collection of video and ephemera at this point, and surprisingly, it works quite well. I'll get it. Oh. And something I'm especially interested in is effective description. How do we document affect in the archive? And so obviously, working with the downtown materials led me to all of this because they raise all of these kinds of problems. We're talking punk art, or punk rock, postmodern, dance, performance art, you name it. If it doesn't fit neatly into a category that the Library of Congress agrees upon, chances are we're interested in it. This is John Sex and the Bodacious Tatas, by the way. John's collection we're actually piecing back together as well, somebody who died without really leaving anything behind. But as you can see, he was a mainstay of the East Village scene. And I want to shout out to Thomas Lax for including Nelson Sullivan's footage in the recent show, because Nelson's collection is 1,600 hours of footage shot between 83 and 93 in the downtown scene, and it's really astonishing work. And I'm glad to see that Nelson's sort of getting his due. What we really need, and what I've been pushing for, is a hybrid organization, and that is we need something that it is a bit like a museum, is a bit like a library or archive, and that finds new ways of describing collections that don't require every item to be described, but that give more description than what archives do at the folder level or box level sometimes. And we need to borrow from the museum certain kinds of descriptions for things like the magic box, which I'll show in a minute. And the Great Gallery and Lynn Gumpert there and I have been working on different projects, really trying to put forward this new model. The downtown show that we did in 2006 was our first big venture into trying to understand how we can put archives into exhibitions in a meaningful way instead of sort of fanning them out like you're going to put a tea cozy next to it and it looks like the beginning of not Great Expectations, what is that? That PBS show I never watched. But I believe documents have their own agency and they should be allowed to speak for themselves. Too often I see a vitrine thrown in an exhibition at the end because the curator says, oh, and I have to have some archival stuff, but it has nothing to do with the centrality of archives to the work itself. That's my pet peeve. I'll get off that soapbox. We have been working with a lot of other galleries, obviously, and museums, and we're going to be working with the Whitney on the big Wojnarowicz show. Because here's the magic box, which you've all probably seen at this point, which really radically altered how I think about collecting and about what we do. When I went to look at Wojnarowicz's papers in storage after he had died, they showed me this, and it has magic box written on top of it, and it has 80 objects inside. And if you know David's work, the objects represent physical representations of his set of symbols that he used. And he never showed it to anyone. He displayed it only once in Peter Hujar's loft after Peter died, so in effect he never displayed it. But I think it's key to understanding his process and why he is a symbolist, and actually why his Catholicism is incredibly important, something that people never talk about other than to talk about his hatred of Cardinal O'Connor. But it's much more important than that. This isn't a work. It's something about process. Most archives would not have acquired it, but I decided that it was essential for understanding David's work. And from then on, I went into trying to help to try to collect and preserve artists' archives and all the problems that come with them. So a lot of the work that I've thought about has come from Diana Taylor, who teaches at NYU. She did a book called The Archive and Repertoire. NYU, of course, created performance studies to a certain extent, as we understand it, and certainly Richard was right there from the very beginning, and TDR has been for the forefront of performance studies. I slightly altered Diana's notion of what archive and repertoire is because I see it from a Foucauldian standpoint. And I'm very interested in the place of nonverbal in memory. And so this is where I think we're going to go. And I'm not going to spend long on this, but I'm really proud because it took me a long time to try to figure out how I think you can schematize what Foucault means by the archive. And I'm specifically using it without the final E because I'm using his notion of the archive. And so if everything exists within power and then there's an archive inside of that, it experiences, bodies get turned into utterances, which eventually become discourses, and discourses allow the construction of narratives and sentences. This all exists within a given time period, a historical a priori, that sets the episteme for that historical a priori. And this is constantly shifting. So if we're going to try to get around this area, which is where most documentation starts to begin, in discourses, narratives, and sentences, we have to intervene somewhere here with the experiences. And I think there are a couple of ways we intervene. One is we try to capture the experience. And of course, with moving image, we have a lot better chance of capturing this than we had historically. But I think there are other ways that we might be able to capture experience here. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about that. You probably all know Anne Chetkovich's work on the archive of affect. And Anne has, looking at trauma studies, she's tried to say, well, how can we document trauma instead of just science? What other means are there? What is not allowed to be written down and why? And of course, that's coming straight out of Foucault. You know, we look at the silences as opposed to what utterances are made. For example, she cites the lesbian experience of AIDS because there were many, many lesbians who took care of gay men who were dying of AIDS. It's a narrative that's just written out of history for a whole variety of reasons. The archive of affects is transmitted through oral traditions and through archives of feeling. And this is where we get into the body itself understanding and experiencing things that may not ever make it into language. I think this is why Foucault ended his work studying the history of sex and sexuality, because he was interested in what the body knows that stands outside of language. It's especially important that he was interested in S&M because he was going to those bodily moments that stood outside of language. And is there a language of the body that has nothing to do with language? This is why I threw Derrida across the room when I first read Archive Fever, because this is an utter piece of shit. But I've said that before publicly, and I will happily say it again. What about traditional materials? I often look at regular books and talk about, you know, this Nuremberg Chronicle is like this. What happens to me when I hold this? Or what happens when I hold the cuneiform tablet in my hand today that fits perfectly because it was made in someone's hand? And these kinds of things, of course, disappear in digitization because we lose scale. And yes, you can put a ruler next to it, but it's nothing like holding it in your hand. So how do we document effective experience? Performance responses. Do we capture people's responses? What is the archive of feeling? I'm going to mention food studies because one of the other collections that we have at NYU is the largest collection of cookbooks in the country, and which makes you think about performance in a lot of different ways. Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gembel is fond of saying that an archive is just a slow event, and which gives a kind of agency to everything that an archive is. This is a quote by Stanley Eveling, actually, which I really take to heart. One of our cookbook conferences recently, someone said, you don't learn to cook from a book. You learn to cook standing next to someone, right? And so there is an inherent something about the performance of the preparation of food that is embodied practice. And that's maybe the easiest way to explain embodied practice to most people is it's like, yeah, I know how to make a 1/4-inch dice, not because it's a 1/4-inch dice, it was because this is how you chop an onion. And I watched people do it. Is there storytelling that's possible beyond oral history, beyond traditional, very structured oral history? And is it possible to use social media now to collect some of this? So 2 projects that we're working on right now to give you an idea of some of the things we're trying to do. Glenn Wharton, who all of you I'm sure know, is teaching at NYU. Now, he came to me with an idea for creating some kind of database about artists' works that will help curators and conservators and installers to accurately recreate work. And he's been very interested in this topic for a long time, but his current interest is in this data resource and how do we turn this into shareable information. And he asked, what collection do you suggest? And we suggested the Wojnarowicz material because David's career is really complicated. He worked in so many media, and we don't know. And especially, I think one of the most important parts of David's work is the installations, and nobody really writes about them. Nobody tries to recreate them. And yet we've realized this summer from working through the slides in the archive that things that are considered works of David's were works, but they were works within installations. And they shift their meaning as they move from installations to installation. This comes as no surprise. This is how David worked in general, but nobody's written about it. And so I think that we're trying to devise some way of understanding that and what kind of model can we put together for sharing this. And we call it the Davids because we have David Keel, David Breslin, and David Wojnarowicz. And so the Davids have been really helpful with this. So that I just said. But the most interesting thing to come out of this was this database structure that a student from the Institute of Fine Arts has come up with, working with all of us, that we need to take the work of art out of the center of the description, out of the center of the database, and we need to put the relationships between people and objects at the center. It has to be about relationships as opposed to about objects. And we think that this is the only way we'll ever get to the bottom of David's practice. So now the question is, and nobody's really done this, can we turn this into a database? Can we turn this into something that is searchable? And can we make all the digital magic happen? The final thing that I just want to mention, because this goes along with it, is there's a project that's being funded by the Mellon Foundation to look at intangible cultural heritage. And I think to a certain extent what we're talking about here is potentially intangible cultural heritage. The part that I'm involved with is with Jerry McDonough from the University of Illinois, and we're going to be looking at traditional foodways and how they are or are not transferred. And so we're going to hope to go beyond sociology, beyond cookbooks, et cetera, and try to see if there are other ways of documenting through digital technology these intangible cultural practices. So there's a lot fermenting right now. It's very exciting. Things that we started 20 years or more ago at Fales are sort of coming to fruition. And happily, digital technology seems like our friend in this, maybe. I don't know. But thank you very much.
There it is. Hi, everyone. So today I'd love to, I think I also took this title from Stuart Comer, inspired by some of the conversations we've been having. And it's a wonderful honor to be in the company of my other fellow panelists and also with all of you in the room. And I'd love to just share a little bit today about the kind of practice that I've used encountering Trisha Brown's body of work. So I came on to work with John Kartenberg in 2001, straight out of college, Bennington College. And one of the primary things I learned in my work with John was this idea of looking at the archival evidence as archival material as evidence of a particular artist's creative lines of thinking. And that the physical material that you look at is some kind of result of choices that were made, creative strategies that were put into motion. And a year after working with John, I began as a performer in Trisha Brown's company. And with Trisha, I was moving through a practice, an embodied practice of looking at her kinetic and visual lines of thinking. So there were these two practices that were converging, one looking at pattern through archival material, and one looking at pattern in the body through these kinetic and visual points of view. The other thing that I would love to add as part of my practice is that I also come from an improvisational base as a performer. And a lot of the way I work with improvisation is about what I call emergent patterns or emergent patterning. So looking at one's self-organizing ways of moving and understanding how those intrinsic ways of moving start to form into different types of structures. And also my work as a movement analyst. I've worked with the Alexander technique and Lavon studies and other points of view that look at patterning. So all of those have converged to be part of my archival practice. And in participating in this talk, it's been wonderful to kind of reflectively look back and see what are some of the things I've done really from a practitioner standpoint or from an intuitive perspective. So before I get going into Trisha's work, I wanted to just give a little bit of an analogy. So in encountering archival material, for me, it's a little bit like being in Waiting for Godot. And this idea that you're in this voided world, and very often you're in a storage closet or a basement with dusty material, videotapes from many years, depending on how large the volume of the collection is. And things aren't labeled, and it's this incredibly mysterious, sort of enigmatic process of learning to find what the shape is of the material and what the patterns are that live through the material. And very often I feel like I'm pushing material into the void and just seeing what resonance starts to take hold or what pattern starts to take hold and what relationships do I start to find across the different aspects of an artist's collection. So with Trisha, one of the things that I'm struck by with Trisha is the archival material is very much a result of her interdisciplinary practice as an artist. So the type of material that emerges from these very particular modes of capture which for me have been drawing, her writings, and the moving image material, become a kind of archival portrait that very much captures her in an interdisciplinary practice. And so this is from Spanish dance, and I found these series of photographs that are moving through this idea of movement in frames. And for those of you who know Spanish dance, you'll be familiar with this visually. But I'm struck by, with Trisha, she's very much thinking about movement in frames. In her early mathematical pieces and in her early accumulation pieces, this idea of what is gesture in its most rudimentary form, and especially kind of connected to the body, what is the mechanical potential of the joints as they bend, straighten, and rotate, and how does that motion in the joints lend the body animate potential? So this idea of gesture in its most kind of rudimentary form, later I start to see translated to the way that larger pieces, larger ensemble pieces are built. So in a moment, I'm going to show you moving image material from Trisha's creation process for Newark. This is shot in 1987. And you start to see that the piece is captured, the way the material is captured is evidence of the way Trisha built material incrementally. And for me, this is very analogous to animation, to moving image, to the idea of Edward Muybridge, other forms that look at this idea of 24 still frames per second, or this idea of movement in frames. So let's take a look at this. So as you're watching, the sequence starts to grow, kind of starts to inchworm out a little bit. And with a piece like Newark, I mean, one of the things talking about embodied experience that's so beautiful with looking at this kind of material is these dancers are repeating this, over a 7-hour day. So it's incredibly virtuosic, this way of building material. Okay, so another aspect of Trisha Brown's practice that we know her for is her drawing practice. And drawings very much serve as an extension, often of her own physical body, but also as a means of capturing schematically or graphing, almost as a kind of notation, some of her creative ideas of motion. One of the things that's really interesting that I've encountered in Trisha's archive is her own personal collection of drawings that were a record of her choreographic ideas from 1971 to 2005. These drawings haven't been shared, for the most part, with the public, except for through some of the research of art historian Susan Rosenberg. And so one of the things that I do in my archival practice is I start to look at how the different collections, how these different modes of capture start to interact. And going back to this idea of joints, Trisha having this obsession with joints, I look at what are the joins in her creative lines of thinking? What are the joins in the archival material? So I get a little dyslexic, on the left is a drawing that I found from one of Trisha's notebooks from the 90s. And you see this gyroscopic motion of the leg that's kind of implied. And then the footage that I'm going to show you is Trisha's improvisations before she was building a piece in 2000 called Rapture to Leon James. And so you'll see in her movement material this wild, relentless, multi-directional sense of the body, this counter-rotational use of the legs and the upper body, which is not a mistake that it's also in reference to Leon James, who, for some of you know, come out of the Lindy Hop tradition, which is also using that vernacular sense of how the legs rotate, how the joints fold, bend, and how the joints straighten, bend, and rotate as well. So this is it's probably hard to read, but this is a snapshot from the database. And so along the lines of what Martin was talking about, part of what we do is we look in the archive about what are the ways we can capture Trisha's creative process. And so the footage that I just showed you was taken from 58 improvisations. And the improvisations were all given names and then were later numbered, and then they were later spliced into larger phrases. So I've worked extensively with Carolyn Lucas, who for many years was Trisha's choreographic assistant and is now one of the associate artistic directors, to essentially decode and translate many of her notations that were taken as she was video recording footage in the studio with Trisha. And so some of the names that are given to the phrase material are things like hard, hardly, bucks up, cutbacks, money turns, thinker phrase, incremental, mono, lateral leg pull walk, Spanish town, doughy man, and so on. And so that's the other thing that I've encountered in Trisha's collection, is that language very much plays a role in how gestural material is captured. And for me, this speaks to the fact that Trisha is not working from a codified vernacular like ballet or Martha Graham or so on. And so this invention of new material, it makes sense to me that she would play with poetic language as another mode of capture to look at some of the resonance of her gestural material. Okay, so this is another portrait that I've created that shows an interaction of one of her drawings with the building material. The building material I'm going to show you is from Astral Convertible that premiered in '91. And the drawing, you can see her playing with this idea of the horizontal and the vertical dimensions in space. And then in these double duets, you start to see that idea kineticized in motion with these trajectories of horizontal and vertical. So in the case of Trisha's archive, I very much see her as a kind of intuitive archivist of her own collection. I see that the drawings, her writings, and the moving image material come together as a kind of portrait that again speaks to her interdisciplinary practice. And I also see the archival material as an extension of her creative practice. I don't see it as purely documentary or it being kind of calcified dance documentation. And so there's this enormous potential to interact with the archival material in what I call kind of a, what is the word that I've been using for it? An embodied porthole. So that through looking at the archival material, there's this opportunity to go back into the past and to understand what some of the patterns were and what some of the creative ideas were that formed the material as a way of seeing where we are now and what resonances are kind of take hold in the body or take hold in company members in 2015. Another part of our practice that we will develop in the next year or so is an oral history project that looks at how different living histories are captured that have been part of the legacy of Trisha's work and part of the social context of Trisha's work. We'll be working with oral historians from the Columbia Oral History Program. And my hope is that we can also develop another component that is a kinetic oral history project that takes short films that look at improvisational portraits of dancers from Trisha's legacy and history to see what resonance is as they conjure the influence of Trisha into their body are left. And so these types of ideas of social context and living history and physical transmission and embodied experience are also very much part of our thinking in the archive. Thank you. How do we turn it off?
I mean, it would be great to read, but this is okay. Oh. Good evening. I was told it was a 10-minute lecture. I'm trying to make it in 10 minutes. With my very poor English, pronunciation, but I hope it's okay for you. I cannot start this semi-improvised lecture without thinking about Tim Mitchell's text called Erasure. I will slip through the places like completely unnoticed. My face will be so ordinary, no one will see me. And if they ask afterwards, like, did you see that man or woman or something? The people will say, who or what? Was there someone here? And if they scan the surveillance tapes from a corridor or streets or a shopping mall, I will not be there, I will not be recognized, not because I'm disguised, but because I will be unnoticeable, nondescript, nothing. My credit cards will leave no trace. My bank transactions will not register. My phone bills won't place me. My records will be lost somewhere, or simply, like I said before, unnoticeable. It's probably weird to quote here a text about erasure and leaving no trace, but a practice around the potential of archive today can't avoid the specificity of our present time. We have recently shifted completely our complex relations to archives, and the shift is never completed. Yesterday, Isadora Duncan was resisting having her dances filmed, where now everybody is being filmed anytime. Centuries of thousands of dancers concerned with leaving a trace and trying to write scores, and now what? Cameras are recording the slightest attempts in dance studios, and every citizen should be concerned about how his or her records are being kept, used, and sold. Only a few years ago, pictures were prohibited in exhibition spaces and theaters. Now there remain surprisingly a few visitors who are turning their mobiles off, while others are discovering the joy and the simplicity of how low-key live streaming done in a few clicks by anybody in front of anything moving. The desire for disappearance in Tim Mitchell's text sounds more and more actual for us all. This is also why the archive problem, with its sets of questions, is burning. Archive is definitely a faux ami, a false friend, a notion and an ensemble of practices and objects that are not as easily understandable as we think. We are looking for a place for preservation and stability, but archive is a battlefield in constant, uncertain evolution. This instability is probably what interests me when I'm trying to connect improvisation and history. Improvisation is often related to pure presence, invention from scratch, looking for the never heard before and the never seen before, and therefore improvisation is often conceived in opposition to the past, the historical research, the archive. But when you start improvising as a dancer, and probably also as a curator, as a scientist, you're very quickly confronted with gestures that are coming back, gestures that keep being reproduced and repeated, even though you would not desire this reproduction and repetition. And while hoping that new moves would arrive, identical patterns are popping up again and again that you have wished to get rid of. Instead of suffering from the difficulty of erasing the past through improvisation, improvisation could be the perfect tool to work on one's own archaeology, history, education, culture. Improvisation could be the right tool to work on memory and history of dance presented on an experimental clinical table. Not that nothing could be invented here, but that nothing could be perceived as coming from the gods. Let me make a short detour through a text suggested to me by Paul Geoffredi, a text written by Maurice Merleau-Ponty, French philosopher. Merleau-Ponty describes in Signe the works of art as being the object of a triple return, une triple reprise. So a triple return that would be present in any work of art. What is this triple return? The first consists in the object of the work, being, let's say, the digestion of the object of the work. That's the first reprise, the first return. The second return would be the art from the past. There is a chain of artworks that lead to one's own artwork. And the third return would be the author's own tradition, because no gesture can be made without the education, the tradition that any artist has from his own culture and critical history, since her first gesture and gaze in life. This triple return remains often hidden, denied, or simply unnoticed. On the contrary, improvisation, defined as a historical tool, would be a good place to reveal, deal with, curate the archive. This improvisation archaeology could unveil these historicities at work. There's no work of art without historicities at stake, and therefore no work of art without a strong embodied link to the past and the archived. Such directions where past and present, creation and historicity are mixed up are important for Musée de la Danse. Musée de la Danse would not primarily focus on saving gesture from the past, maintain and solidify it, but interrogate the past in the present, invent a museum, start a museum, dream of a museum for the art that is needed today and tomorrow. Musée de la Danse has set as a general precept in its exhibitions and researches that it shall be improvised more than constructed. The foundations of Musée de la Danse are open and permeable to let movements circulate from text to art rooms to public spaces, from archives to brains and back again, from transmission to professional performances, from participatory and social movements to singular acts, from dance to be visited to dance visiting you. Musée de la Danse is trying to make up a new kind of public space where theory and practice would like each other. A space where dance could be experienced in its wider spectrum. Dance to be read, seen, written, visited, guessed, performed, forgotten, or even erased sometimes. I did myself a work called Flipbook that could be seen as an example of such processes. It was presented here at MoMA, curated by Ana Janevksi in 3 collective gestures. It's a mixture between improvisation and archive, performance and memory, stillness of photographies and movements of the bodies and vice versa, movement of the pictures and stillness of the performers. I shall say a word about how it functions. 50 years of dance of Merce Cunningham have been turned into a 300 pictures book by David Vaughan, who is the editor of the book and archivist of the Merce Cunningham Company. This book has been then turned into a performative flip book of more or less 50 minutes with the 300 pictures learned by heart and performed at relative high speed, like in a flip book. Many versions have existed so far. Dancers from the book performing their own pictures and life, professional performers confronting their own techniques and cultures, to this one, amateurs and even children doing the same process to jump into the wild and slightly dangerous space of American modern dance. And for New York, even a visitor's version was created with, among them, the dedicated Yvonne Rainer. The archive, and here even the creation of the archivist, is being used in the studio, placed onto the stage, and even swallowed as mental and physical food. The main trick of this transformative process is that connecting randomly the many pictures resembles the processes of Merce Cunningham himself, where many different positions would be connected to create a dance that wasn't organically produced. In this project, the archive is creating a work that could not exist without the existence of this archive, leading to unpredetermined evolutions. One could add that computer design, as Merce did use for some of his choreographies, is being replaced by low-tech book choreography, an homage to the photographical art of dance as a repertoire of movement and not only stillnesses. We are doing this to get free from our own systems and contemporary modes of thinking, to get a refresh on how energy may come not from the usual oral tradition of dance, but from a book teaching us how to perform. The absence of the choreographer could even be productive. Actually, Merleau-Ponty has also some lines about the fact that he thinks that the projects, the works from the past have a desire for the future. So in fact, that the actual artworks are not only responding to the artwork from the past, but because the archive and the artwork from the past are maybe asking something. They are demanding for future movement that we are doing now. So somehow, as if the archive is looking forward and making us react. In 20 Dancers for 20th Century, the first collective gesture at MoMA, the archive isn't present and visible, but 20 dancers are invited to present their own museum, reflect on their own archival spaces, their body as recipients and producers of their art and culture. 20 dancers are invading a space and improvise from their memories, solo gestures from the 20th century, simultaneously during 4 to 5 hours usually. In MoMA or Tate, modern, there was a confrontation between the artworks of the collections and the collections of fragile dances improvised in the conditions of the exhibition spaces. But at Paris Opera, last month, the confrontation was absent. In the Temple of Ballet, the dancers of the house would try to reach the shores of modernity by performing works from Chaplin, Mike Kelly, Vito Acconci, modern dance pioneers, choreographers of the 90s, dancers from films like Et Dieu créa la femme with Brigitte Bardot, or White Nights with Gregory Hines and Baryshnikov, to even Crump and voguing, but learned in a few days. The archive isn't made visible, but the dancers are addressing the audience verbally to explain where they got the scores or the transmissions. The dancers are creating a live exhibition that could not happen without an apparatus of researchers and archives, and not without their own experience. That is as well a very active archival space. I think that's it, but I think that's it, yeah. From these two examples, Um, this could let you think that Musée de la Danse focused mainly on live exhibitions, where archives would be incorporated and or excavated. But actually we did counterbalance these essays with film exhibitions, media work, installations. We just closed an exhibition with Yvonne Rainer films. We did monographies on Larry Bott. We did Anne-Theresa Kersmacher's film exhibition. We did also a film and media work to sum up Jérôme Bell's, let's say, ideology and body of work. And we also did larger collective projects like Brouillon, Moments, Photo Museum, or La Permanence. That was a one-year-long exhibition in Rennes with the support and the co-production of Fonds National d'Art Contemporain, the FNAC. And just to say that even if I mentioned two projects where the archive was really embodied or worked in a very specific way, we did many other projects where you could see films, you could read, you could have the text for real in the exhibition spaces. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all the free speakers for these excellent presentations. Maybe we move the chairs a bit closer or somehow. I don't know. As I said, I would really like this to be a common discussions, but we have this set up as us being a bit taller. But anyway, we'll try. So I will just go in media res also because not to stay here too long, but there is something that there is a word that came out in all the three presentation. And to introduce it, there's some notes that came out there was when Boris presented Free Collective Gestures with the Musée de la Danse 2 years ago. As he said, the first project was 20 dancers. So 20 dancers who invaded the space, a kind of a living history of dance, living archive, who performed and improvised during opening hours of the museums. And it was an extraordinary experience. Of course, it was also a criticized project for what you said, the fragile dancer with the work of art and collection. And it's something that I like to call, and this is a translation from Croatian, which is my mother tongue, like playing dirty. I know it in English can have other connotations, but like playing dirty, I mean, it's not perfect, of course, but you know, you're trying, it can be pleasant, and you know, it's a lot of thinking behind, and I think it opens up important questions. And then we were asked, like, how, of course, being in an institution, the questions that we were asked, like, how would you collect this? You know, how this would become real kind of a archive, you know, how to assimilate it in the institutional context. And Kathy Halbrecht, the associate director at MoMA, she said something that I really like to quote. There isn't one protocol as much as we want to systematize and have a template. There are differences in how artists deal with history, and the institution should remain pliable to accept that for an intellectual gift. And the word that really came out of the free presentations is improvisation. You know, you mentioned it, all of you, like intuitive archiving, like you're suggesting the archaeology of improvisation. So I wanted just maybe to see if you're all using improvisation in the same way. What does improvisation mean for all of you? Because of course for Boris, it's, as you said, the gestures that are haunting, that are coming back and back. And you know, we saw the recorded of Trisha's improvisation. The improvisations have names. You also talk about improvisations of the visual art. So I would really like you to expand on improvisation. And also, we are in the process of acquiring Simone Forti's dance construction. So it's another really another set of questions in terms of improvisation. So it seems something that is really coming, and we have to deal with.
Yeah, improvisation is such a complicated concept and word. I mean, in my practice, the way I work with improvisation is this idea of looking at almost this idea of what would somebody's neuronal patterning be. I feel like it came up in Boris's, when you were talking, this idea of the kind of habit we return to time and time and time again. There is a kind of almost like blueprint for somebody's thinking or way of intrinsically patterning movement that starts to show up if you look at a certain amount of material over a period of time. I feel like it's pretty rare if somebody has like a very, very divergent patterning from one day to the next. Certainly we have different life experiences that kind of allow us to shapeshift and change and transform, but there's also a kind of like habitual patterning that we come back to. So that's part of my own practice when I'm teaching, when I'm working with people, both with Alexander technique, with improvisation, with creative practice, is something that I call creative mapping. And so when I'm working in archives, I very much bring that sensibility to how I'm looking at material over time. Maybe that's all I'll say for now.
I think it's also connected to the museum somehow. When dancers are invited to museums, and Musée Lens is different because we are inviting our own museum. But when we got an invitation, when dancers come in the museum, then let's say we are seen as fragile, and then maybe we have a tendency to do works that are as heavily framed or as solidified, let's say, as the other artworks present in the rooms, or as what we think a collection would be, an archive would be. And maybe it was, I would mention maybe the early works of Tino Sehgal that would be in that sense a framing, like a cheval de Troie, a Trojan horse, where you would frame any immaterial movement, gesture, choreography, but as a normal artwork, in the sense that as a sculpture, as a live sculpture, something you could acquire, something that exists, it exists through oral transmission, so it's very, you're not sure what you have, but basically framing it to be sure it fits the hours of opening, it fits you can compare one to one let's say the normal artwork or the sculptures or the installations to what we would do as dancers, what we would do as performers. And somehow, maybe because I'm a next generation, I'm coming after, or because we discussed a lot, also Anna together, about what could we do at MoMA, how could we do improvisation would mean how to import fragility in the museum, how to accept the fact that you're not sure, and it could be the strength and not the weakness of the dancers, is that the dancer have many artworks in his body, so he's not only representing the Marina Abramovic gesture, he can do something else, and you're never completely sure what he or she is doing is really what you expect being the Trisha Brown gesture from this one piece. You're never sure. He tells, he's also looking for it. So there's in the word improvisation, which is a very complex word, and I agree, the fact that in a museum it could be a research place, it could be a place to discuss, you're trying to do something, an attempt, and somehow through the MoMA's experience we had, it was clear that we did present projects that have a stable protocol. 20 dancers for 20th century. We knew we would ask specialists, amazing researchers and dancers to present the dancers. So it's not just improvised, but somehow the way to perform, the way to deal with the spaces, with the other artworks, would be improvised. And this improvisation would be maybe something we could bring to the museum. I could say improvisation and danger, almost. Of course, a sense of we are not sure what will happen. We are not sure what these people will do. Will they stop or perform? And I think this instability is maybe needed in the libraries, in the collections, or even in the exhibitional spaces.
I'm just going to throw out a few things I'm thinking about this. One is when does improvisation stop, and when does it become reified by the systems that are trying to document it? When does it stop being improvisation and become an archival document? And I absolutely agree that archival documents are unstable, and they're very unstable. I tell graduate students whenever I talk to them about archives, the most important thing is to remember that archives lie, because they don't tell the truth. There are all kinds of reasons why they don't tell the truth. People omit things, the wrong things were kept, the right things disappeared, especially when you're talking about this kind of stuff. It's very, very ephemeral. Do we need to think about jazz here and why jazz doesn't worry at all about this? as a question, because there's no plastic object. Are we so, in the libraries and in museums, so fixed on the plastic object that keeps us from documenting installation practice in Vonerovich, for instance, which I'm sort of obsessed with right now, which were collaborative works. And, you know, where's he in it? It's called his, but there were 10 people working on it. And for me, downtown keeps asking these questions again and again, because that's what the artists were doing. They were pushing those kinds of moments. So it's kind of, yeah, it's a difficult stance to be someone who's trying to archive that which was questioning the very nature of the archive. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's what I deal with every day. It goes to a question that I was thinking about. What you said, though, is your work with the archive beyond description? And is it now scholarship about the archive, as opposed to just presenting archival evidence? To me, it would be, because you're taking things that are disparate within the archive and presenting them as a new kind of work and understanding. And that's scholarship to me, as opposed to just providing the material. Or do we need a new definition of what the archive is when it comes to these works? And that's something that I don't have an answer for, but I thought I would ask you.
Yeah, I think I see my practice as very interpretive, and I feel like anybody who has encountered the recreation or restaging or capturing or documentation of the work, of Trisha's work, I see all of our roles as interpretive. So for me, knowing that, it kind of helps have an improvisational license, in that I don't see that necessarily I'm representing Trisha Brown in the words she would use or the thought processes she may have, because I'm not inside of her head, but it's part of my own improvisational practice for how I encounter the work. And through playing with juxtaposition and lining up some of the patterns that I see appearing across the collection, it's just part of my own practice that I'm presenting to you guys. That's part of how I come to learn more about the material. But I'd also love to say something, if it's okay, Ana, in response to what Martin was talking about. Another part of my research as a performer has been an engagement and research with different vernacular and underground movement forms, and very, very different from the cultural perspective of postmodernism and Trisha's work. And it's been really interesting for me to actually witness that many of, for example, I was working with the House of Ninja, Voguing House. They have an archive, and I was also working with a woman named Betsy Betos, who was an eccentric dancer, and she inherited many of the libraries and private collections from many of the masters of eccentric dance, and they have an archive. And most underground movement artists that I've worked from have their own archive of material, of influences that they carry with them, including artists like Bill Irwin and so on. So that's just I feel like that speaks to maybe a slightly different perspective, which is this idea of those forms are coming from social, there's a different relationship to authorship, and nobody owns voguing or owns popping or owns eccentric dance or so on. And so there's a different way that the culture comes together to kind of carry forward certain legacy ideas. And the archival material for me becomes this, again, porthole into making sure that certain social contexts and living histories that were part of the creation of those forms are not omitted or flattened or colonized or lost through their appropriation. So I just wanted to add that as maybe like a totally different window into my archival practice.
And that's one of the hardest things to do, is to try to create systems outside of a big institution like NYU, when you're bucking the way everything is set up to be cost effective. Not that it ever is, but you know, for instance, I love this example. David Wojnarowicz's book, Memories That Smell Like Gasoline, many of you probably remember, it's a beautiful little art book that was published after he died, was classified by the Library of Congress under AIDS in the medical, as a medical book, instead of as an artist's book. And David was notorious for going into bookstores and moving all of his books out of the gay section into literature, because he didn't want to be ghettoized in the gay literature section at that point. But the Library of Congress has just turned him into an AIDS patient and stopped making him an artist. And that's hardwired into the system. So it's a problem we face all the time. We're trying to do justice to these materials without bringing, just letting them go down the great maw of the institution.
Yeah.
So there's something about improvisation that's caught up in all of this as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can improvisation function as a lever to break open those structures? And how do we allow that to be maintained in the archive?
Yeah. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Someone have a hand up?
Well, I have a question. Just a few things, a very little treat.
He'd like.
No, well, okay. First, a provocative thing, and then a question. The provocative thing is, what's the relationship between archive and surveillance? Because it seems like they're connected theoretically at some level, and that one is the dark side of the other. So I'll put that out there. The second one is, I'm thinking of Charles Ludlam. And Charles pillaged everything he could, like in Bluebeard, many pieces. So what would you feel, archivists, let's say if I came and I said, I want to take Trisha Brown's stuff, and I want to use it. I don't want to particularly attribute it. I just want to take an accumulation here, something there, and you've got it there, and I want to use it. Fuck copyright, fuck any of that. I'm going to distort it. I'm going to use it any way I want as material to make something new, because these are different, a remix, as it were, because the stuff in the archive is so fabulously interesting and provocative to artists. So I think there's one direction where this material is addressed to scholars, historians, preservation, and that's the surveillance part. We really want to know who you are. The other part is distortion, recreation, remixing, in which you say, I want to take it, as Charles would have taken, and redo it and put your stuff literally in the public domain. So I just want to hear what you guys have to say about those two ideas. Thank you.
And maybe we can also include our archivist, Michelle Aligot, who can answer also one of these ideas. Yeah.
Well, I can give you the NYU response, and I can give you my response, because I would give the artist both responses. I could say, okay, technically you have to clear all these copyrights with the person from whom you're using the material, unless, according to the copyright law, you sufficiently alter it so that it becomes a new work. And that's litigated again and again and again. This is all about the mouse, right? This is all about Mickey Mouse. These copyright laws are all to make sure that the mouse stays the mouse and that nobody gets, any. And Beckett's not, and what's his name? Catcher in the Rye is Salinger. I mean, these are where these copyright laws have come from. And they're based on print culture. And they don't work for the arts in general. Now, personally, when artists come and want to do things, I say, okay, here's a piece of paper that says you're not going to sue NYU for your misuse of it. So do whatever the hell you want. Artists come in all the time, especially students, and look at the archive to get ideas for materials, and are creating new work.
Taking things that's recognizable. We know how to transform things. But when Charles, let's say, did Bluebeard, you knew he was doing Isle of Dr. Moreau. You knew he was doing a particular film. And he wasn't trying to disguise it. He wasn't trying to avoid anything. He was simply ripping it off. So what would your attitude be to simply ripping it off? Especially Trisha Brown, because I think what you're showing is very precise stuff, and Trisha is very precise. And what would your attitude be?
Oh, wow. I was just having this conversation with about 3 people in separate conversations this week. Yeah, this kind of feels like, do I give my archive director response or my personal response? It's interesting because as in... it's interesting that you bring this up because part of my artistic work that is interdisciplinary in nature with performance and film does work very directly with appropriation. A lot of my work borrows from influences from eccentric dance and Bill Irwin and vaudeville and clown and so on. And the way that I approach it as an artist is I find it's very important, especially, I think, this idea of appropriation or sampling, it shows up in music, it shows up in visual arts, it shows up across the board, found footage, people working in expanded cinema, so on. I think when it comes to performance, one of the difficulties is that it's the body, and I think it's social context, and not that it's not in all of the other forms, but I think the other forms create some kind of illusion of distance to being able to manipulate something outside of oneself. And with the body, I feel like there are certain ethical implications of what that means when it was part of certain living histories and traditions. So when I've played with appropriation, it's been very important for me to engage very directly with creators from certain forms, and to spend like a period of training and improvisational investigation with understanding what the ideas are in the work, what the improvisational or what I call the living ideas are in the work, rather than taking something, mimicking it, representing it, codifying it. Those, for me, take works towards in the direction of calcifying them or ossifying them. And so for me, it's this idea of appropriation. It's like, for what end or to what aim? Does it show something different about our positionality in culture right now to repeat and reconstruct and kind of bite or soundbite something that an artist has already made? I kind of go in the direction of hoping that it can have enough distortion or enough transformation that it becomes a new work, and that we see something else rather than like a direct stealing or ripping of the material. So, or unless the artist says this is a direct stealing and ripping of the material, that might do something more ethical for me personally.
I mean, because what you are mentioning is from artist to artist. Let's say I'm a choreographer, or I'm a filmmaker, I steal from another filmmaker. But actually, in dance, there's another problem that is very important for me and for many people, is that the author rights are owned by the choreographer, or then by the foundation or the heritage, etc. But actually, in these pictures, you see dancers, and there's quite a big author rights problem with dancers, because actually even if a dancer spent 20, 30, 40 years of his or her life working with someone, the author, the choreographer, which is a fragile author that needs to be also supported, that needs to be protected, that needs to earn money to do this or that. But nevertheless, the dancer, who is maybe the most fragile character in this system, even though he gave movement, even though he gave, of course, hours of his time, his energy, fed the discussions, and even though these movements made him or herself do who he or she is. So to the point that sometimes if you dance with this or that choreographer after 10 years, whatever you do, people are like, but it looks so much like Forsyth's word. But basically in terms of legal rights, so far, the dancer has no right. Basically, even the solo or duet I did myself, providing the movements myself for this or that choreographer, I have no right to do it. So this is maybe a slightly different question than the one you asked, which is maybe you could say, it seems on the side. It's so important because as a dancer, you are not authorized to own, let's say, your own experience. And it was I worked in here and then in many other projects with Shelley Center, who is an amazing dancer and let's say thinker of Trisha Brown's heritage, and to say, okay, we don't own the author rights, but can we at least own our own experience and dispose it? So have the right to do so. It's still an open question because then you do what you can, but we are really in an era where in dance, it has become more and more important because maybe some important choreographers just died. How are the rights being dealt? And it's a very delicate question because you cannot just steal and that's it, but it remains. I have another answer, very short. That is, I worked with Odile Duboc, a French choreographer. When she died, she said, I hate what is done usually after the death of choreographer. So it's forbidden to do basically anything. She said a few things can be done, the rest is forbidden. You can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that. And then there's somebody who is responsible for the rights and who say, you can't do that. So looking for, and you cannot do that. But I was thinking, the good thing in this, like there's a cross, you can't do anything. But then if you really have the strongest desire to do this or that, is it a remake? Is it a distortion? Then you do it. So I liked, so at first I thought it's terrible that some of the pieces I've done, I cannot do them. But then I felt if we also collectively, not only me as a dancer, but collectively we think we have to make this one piece live again, we would go against her will, but this would mean we would have the guts, or we would have the, and I was thinking maybe there's a lot of stops. Now we have legal matters, we have cases, we have problems with the horror, but then we as artists, we are pushed, because if we really want to do something, then we have to do it anyway.
And Adrian here would call you, is this the persistence of performance, in a way? What just, yeah.
There's also a huge problem here of the notion of authorship. I mean, we're borrowing the notion of authorship from literary studies, and that's the problem. Because we know that these dances aren't created by a single choreographer. They're created in workshop with the dancers, and the dancer affects what the choreographer does as well. And it's just like any musical performance. I mean, I'll betray that I was trained as a classical musician originally, and you know, it's not written in stone. You know, Beethoven interpreted it this way. Maybe he didn't get it right. You know, the intentional fallacy comes up in nearly every one of these presentations I do, and it seems like nobody in the art world has heard of the intentional fallacy. The intentional fallacy means that maybe the artist didn't really know what he was doing, or she was doing, and the work is greater than their talent was actually possible. And the other thing that I really loved, and I don't remember which poet said it, but you know, immature poets imitate, mature poets steal. Yeah, but somebody had a question. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it's a follow-up for the surveillance question. I wonder if, given that technology now allows us to archive everything relentlessly, can we over-archive? Is it possible to over-archive? When do we decide that there is too much archiving?
That was my question, and we don't have an answer, because look what everybody does with social media. I don't care. I profoundly don't care about most of the shit that I see that people post.
So how are you dealing with that? Are you just ignoring it?
No, we haven't quite figured out what's going to happen with all of it. A lot of it will just disappear anyway, because through natural selection, archives shrink. I mean, archives shrink. We have
Again, valid rad, no?
yeah, we have very little of what was created historically, so maybe that doesn't matter. And the sad thing is maybe the crap gets kept. And the way that what really often happens in collections is the very best stuff gets used up and disappears. And I know that that's terrifying for, you know, thoughts for libraries and archives, but there's a lot of crap in our collections that no one cares about. How many Reformation tracts were printed that had no effect whatsoever, but they survived, but the ones that were really important got read to pieces? It's a karmic hit we all have to take. That was a phrase that I had up that actually Ann Chetkovich said to me when I was talking about this once.
I was really struck by, I think, the way you were talking about, I don't think you had gone to the database yet, but incorporating the relationships into how you decide what to keep and all of that. And I think I just happened to have gone to an event yesterday where there was an Indigenous person who was doing a performance that had been passed down. And I do feel like this overall conversations, there's something that's very, I think, Western about it, for lack of a better word, that is very based on the structural political structure, I guess, as opposed to what is more of and it's sort of interesting against what you're talking about, the downtown scene, where so much of it is about breaking and, you know, having to get away from whatever structure you were at. But there is something about some traditional forms that is potentially really interesting here in the way that you are teaching, you know, from the elders to the younger, how to participate in these forms. And this idea of ownership is really more about the relationship you have to this culture and to these elders and to these people, and then honoring that in kind of the way that you're talking about with the dancers. And I guess I'm wondering if I'm hearing you correctly. That's the part that I feel is really interesting. And so for the museum, I'm almost picturing more of a dance floor in part of the library so that you can track these things, so that there's some teaching as opposed to figuring out the data set in your FileMaker database, and what are the possibilities for that?
Well, I guess two things. Diana Taylor's work is specifically about Latin American performance, and the fact that their texts, their codices, don't function like texts as we think them at all. They're more directions for performances, and some of the ones she's working with specifically are for dance pieces that aren't dance because they're a part of a religious performance, but they are dance. It's much more complicated. So she's coming exactly out of that, and I'm sort of notioning toward that. And yet, all the downtown collections were clearly steeped in Western culturalism. Let's face it. The galleries and all were set up to make money, and et cetera. I mean, there was a lot of pushback going on, but still, they're within that tradition. But I think there is a lot to learn from, especially how Indigenous studies have done it right in a lot of ways, and we have a lot still to learn, and archives really haven't caught up with that. Some have, but not nearly enough. You said something else, but what the interesting thing about the database is how can we collect the information about the relationships and display it so you don't have to spend 40 years learning about Oscar Wilde and his circle, which I've done, and I know who all the connections are, but imagine if a scholar could come in and say, okay, well, who was Robert Sheridan, and what was his role? And then go from there. It would just be so much easier for scholarship.
I'm actually really interested in that because we're actually building part of our database exactly that way.
Mm-hmm.
Actually understand how artists have worked with other artists just because they've gotten on board, and then how that feeds together. And it's actually, from what our database manager says, very possible. It's actually really exciting.
Yeah. There's a national project from the National Archives to aggregate finding aid information, which is the descriptive material about archival collections, and then to go in and do this kind of mapping of place, name, title, and then it on the fly creates a chart for you so you can see what the relationships of people across collections across the country are. So we're on the tip of digital technology actually really opening up collections in a way that they never did in the past. The problem is we have to spend the time putting the information in at the beginning, and the trend is toward less information as opposed to more, because the archival collections have grown so vast in the past 50 years. But yeah, it's interesting right now. It's a fascinating time to be involved in archives.
Linda, there is a question there.
At the risk of sounding irreverent, it seems to me that a great antidote to, there's a confusion between authorship and authority, and a kind of desire on the one hand for comprehensiveness or accuracy or, revisionist, rethinking of more comprehensive, more true relation, as in what you've suggested about the relationships as opposed to. But by the same token, it strikes me that one of the best antidotes to the illusion of authority and authorship that happens because of money and credit and multiple motives is that everyone consider, that everyone is an author, so that the nature of your research is understood. I like that you called yourself a scholar, that it's understood as your creation, this archive. And if everyone, so if the dancer signs the work, just so that everyone is credited. Even thinking about the David Wojnarowicz and the mistaken shuffling it into the medical file, that's an interesting fact. It acknowledges something about the culture. If that's acknowledged and just indexed in your filing and refiled, it seems to me more valuable than the notion that yours is more correct. I don't know if that makes sense. So
yeah,
I'm just
absolutely.
saying.
I mean, what we're talking about is the fact that system of power and control over who says something is what is historically based, and that's what happened with David there. But I think we should admit up front that all archival processing, and that's what I mean by organizing and making it accessible, is already biased in various ways, and we can't get around that. But we can try. We can try to do better than we have in the past. And that's what, it's been an experiment. It's a sort of an ongoing project of mine to see just how can we do that with the downtown material, because it's a sort of casebook in how to rethink how we do these kinds of things. Because let's face it, they were engaged in institutional critique at the most primary level, and I don't mean just institutional critique in scare quotes in the art world, but in a kind of postmodern gesture about structure. That's the only thing I think that holds downtown together. I mean, you know, it's a total fabrication. Let's face it, I created the term downtown, or so I sort of stole it actually from a couple of places, but people now have a real sense of what it is, and I don't have a real sense of what it is. Other than it's a series of gestures that certain kinds of artists were making in the 70s that led to the 80s. And it probably died off in the 90s because everybody died of AIDS.
This reminds me, Boris, of the project you did in Karlsruhe in Germany, which was like history of performance in 10 acts. When also we mentioned, I think Marvin, you mentioned the way that archives are also represented in exhibitions, or not represented, unfortunately, sometimes. When you tried really to break those borders between the artwork and the archives and try to make them, you know, to have some kind of a living narration through the archives. So if you can just say more about that. And you have also problems with that, so there is something kind of a preciousness of the archives.
It was an exhibition called Moments, curated by Georg Schollhammer and Sigrid Gerais and me, where we would work with 10, so the archives of 10 women, performance artists, and it was how do we do it? So how do we exhibit it? What do we do? And the first idea was to say, okay, these artists are still alive. They will come to the ZKM and they will basically work on their own archive. So nobody will tell them how to archive their own work, but they will organize it as they want it in a way. And then I thought, but that's the best exhibition if you have I don't know, Yvonne Rainer coming and arranging her own archive, or this is the best thing that can happen here. Like not only to see the different films, the different installations, pictures, the documents, the text, but herself would be someone else as well, coming, and Lynn Hirschman coming and organizing her own archive. I thought this would be the best gesture, so to speak. And then I thought, but what do we do? I was called as a dancer to be part of it. Also, then we would reconstruct in the exhibition some of the performances. But how would you reconstruct a work performed in Argentina, where people would be locked in a visual art gallery, and then to escape they would have to break the window, and it was performed during the dictatorship. You are now in Karlsruhe in the 2000s. What do you do? You know, so I thought what we would do as artists of now would be to add archives. So we have the 10 women organized an archive, but we spend quite a lot of time in the exhibition with the archives. I forgot how many. It was 2 weeks, I think, where we spend time there to think how can we deal with the archive. So not if we want to reconstruct, why not? But how can we deal with the questions of what can we do today? What can we? So we did let's say research group or performance group where we would basically work inside this museum, the ZKM, within the archive, like an island that would be made of the different archives. But we would invent our own. We would be completely free. We would be completely wild to do whatever we wanted. If we wanted to steal, if we wanted to do, and it was very. It was difficult in a way, and it was very difficult for the museum itself to have these people who could maybe endanger the archive, also endanger, and not. The artists didn't have problems so much, but maybe the insurance companies could have problems. Maybe the ZKM could have problems, because if something gets damaged, then in a next exhibition they will not be able to get the loan. So how could we deal with that? And within an exhibition that was about performance in the 70s, and that was really with hardcore performance, also political performance, and clear gestures also. So we did that, and then Ruti Sela, an Israeli filmmaker, spent time with us and filming what we would do discussions and then editing in the exhibition and presenting in the exhibition a film about what we are doing. So adding one more archive, that would be the film she would do. And on top of that, students staying from different art schools in Europe, staying, assisting the whole process and adding their own work at the end of the exhibition. So it was to not let the archive alone, maybe, to profit from the artist being alive and working on it, and then to react with the archive, but not only in the, like, we are disciples, not only what can we take from this film and redo, but be really much more free in what could be an exhibition using these archives. And maybe it was a big failure in a sense that it was so difficult for between the artists and the museums, it was really, but at the end, for example, there's one little film by Ruti Sela called The Witness. It's a 10-minute film, and you see all the problems of this project, which I think is what we had tried in this 8 weeks exhibition process.
David?
I have a very simple question, maybe. I guess it's mostly for Marvin, though please, anybody feel free. Is it possible to refuse the archive? Like, practically, could an artist say, I don't want my work archived, don't put it in the Fales, or don't acquire it?
Why not? I tell people, most of the other archivists in the room might be terrified by this, but I say, you own your own identity. If there's stuff that you don't want to be known, don't give it to us, because if you give it to me, I have to take care of it. But if I don't know about it, destroy it. You have the right to control your own identity. Even diaries. I mean, Eddie Ellis, who wrote a 400,000 word diary that he kept for most of his life, like from the time he was 14 till he died at 89, said that he thought that about 95% of it was true. Some people don't want their work preserved. Fine.
Can you restrict it and say 50 years from now it's open?
Sure. If people, in fact, we do that with a lot of, because we're dealing often with living people or people who died recently, there are restrictions that we commonly put on material that's sensitive. I'd rather that than them throw it out, and often they'll agree to that. Or once you've said, well, I'd be happy to restrict it, they say, oh, it's not that important, they'll just let it be open anyway. The only thing about restrictions is they have to have a hard time limit. And I don't take anything that's not donated. I don't take any things on loan. New York's too expensive to be a warehouse.
Microphone. So I do feel like younger artists are supported in looking for funding in a different way, so much to the point that this documentation of your work has become a real issue and is they're hyper aware of, and perhaps makes the idea of archiving easier. But it came up during this convening that I think some of us were at in Minneapolis about, should commissioning institutions really be thinking about archiving at that point? Should artists be thinking about what they have? But not every artist is Trisha Brown. Not every artist is, drawing every single thing and thinking about it. And I'm just curious what you each think about.
And
this.
I also does Musée de la Danse, or you, Boris, do you think about archives and archiving? And
for example, Musée de la Danse doesn't have an acquisition budget, so basically,
you can archive your what your activities.
We do archive as much as we can, but a lot of the projects we are doing are not easily, let's say, we did, for example, a film, an interactive film installation about Expo Zero, one of the projects. We did several editions. We did a film, and somehow it's not really photogenic what we have. Then we have some text. But for many projects, for 20 dancers for the 20th century, if you film it while everybody is there, it's really messy, you don't hear much. If you film it without the audience, then it's just solo, then it doesn't represent what we do. So it's maybe the most interesting projects are the most difficult to archive or to leave really good traces. And that's it's an open issue, I would say. But with Musée de la Danse, because we're inventing this museum, we are on the move, somehow we don't look back so much, and maybe not enough, but we are just going on and let's see what what we'll have. And unfortunately, some artists like Pierre Le Guillon, visual artists, or other people did create works that we could keep forever. So he, for example, he bought 400 pictures, more or less dance-related pictures on the internet. He made little boxes that you can unfold like a small-scale architectural design of a modern museum. These boxes, so it's an installation, but it also exists on the web, and you can also perform the opening, the unfolding of this museum, and this remains as a real artwork that we can have. We can and some artists helped us in that way, but for a lot of our projects, we should be helped.
But I like in the interview with Giuliotti that I really liked. It was also part of Stuart Comer's Whitney Biennial 2 years ago now. You're talking how, I'm paraphrasing now, the trauma is the start of the archiving. Now the archive comes from a trauma. The need of the archives comes also from some kind of a trauma. And again, I can't not help thinking about Walid Rad, no, and this idea that somehow, the civil war is happening. There are no structures, absolutely, for any kind of archiving. And if you think also a lot of Eastern European artists, there is a lot of process of self-archivization also. And just a short anecdote: when I was in Beirut first time, which was now I think 6-7 years ago, and I had all this knowledge of Walid Rad or Akram Zaatari of the Arab Image Foundation, so this like self-organized archives, fictional archives, who are exactly telling you all the problems that you need an archive, but an archive is problematic, is a fake friend. And I went there with a very, very, very weird mission to research a Polish architect who came after the war to Beirut and built half of Beirut. He was not especially a visionary architect, but really like a very solid architect who built a lot of buildings in Beirut. And there was a professor at the American University in Beirut who did a PhD on him. And I met him, and we like drove around like the city, and he was showing me all the buildings. And then he told me, now I'm going to show you the archive, the Karl Schneider archive. And I was like, oh, where's the archive? And he said, come. So we went on in a building. It was the 4th floor of a building, where people live. And he started explaining me the archive. He has his own archival system. There was like maquettes, diaries, correspondence, photos, unrealized project, furniture, and so on. And I was a bit confused, like, where are we? And then he explained, well, this is my apartment. And I did it because the Association of Architects in Beirut, it's not really working, and then I had internal fights. So I moved. I have another apartment now, and this is my apartment. So all this, like, artistic, that for me were artistic strategies, actually, they were part of the day. So it's interesting, this. I think you mentioned the authority, the author, because also archive is a privilege in a way. So I think that's something that's, coming to mind, and maybe also because this fragility, it's the reason why it's a kind of an agony also when we think about performance, and it's so inspiring me. There's so much thinking about that. I don't know if this is no, Stuart. Yeah.
I just wanted to get back to Martin's point about the nonverbal, and I love the metaphor of learning to cook standing next to somebody cooking, and the extent to which in terms of all the systems of control that have been mentioned, video is of course a military development, and so getting back to the most embodied thing of all, which is the body, and the extent to which we should be engineering new modes of learning from body to body, within the museum, and how we need to rethink the function of the museum as a learning institution where learning is happening from body to body and not just through talking. But I think also in conventional museological terminologies, archive somehow suggested something that was not an artwork and had a discursive function or historical function. And I think it's very clear in all of these presentations that now has a certain power that's highly desirable and positions a cultural artifact, or whatever you want to call it, as a more active agent in constructing a history. But between, I guess I'm curious about, where bodies can come in and how we can rethink the body as a document in a way.
It's actually kind of interesting because I do very much relate to this idea of an archive having a relationship to power structures and privilege, and it takes a certain artist's sensibility to be savvy enough to save things that they've made. In my artistic practice, I don't save my archival material, which is funny that I'm engaged in archives. But I think part of that is that my work in Trisha's archive feels like an extension of my own creative practice. But oh, I just lost my thought. What was the first thing I said? Power structures. Well, what I was going to say is when I'm teaching Trisha's material, now I'm teaching Trisha's material through the archival material. So even though there's like this idea of this kind of power structure in archival material, I find that I could stand up in front of dancers and use my body and kind of be this example of a Trisha Brown repertory and ask them to replicate me and copy me in various ways, but I'm not at all interested in that. So a lot of times I'll show them, if we're learning glacial decoy, I'll show them glacial decoy, the original footage, Trisha building the material, the improvisational material. We'll have conversations about it, and then there will be ways that I engage with them in drawing and mapping of the material to get at, again, like what are the patterns that are part of like the sort of intrinsic grammar or like lexicon of movement that are sort of like underneath the framework of the movement. And we had a really interesting experience recently where I asked students to create line drawings of the set and reset phrase material, and then we grouped I mean, some of this is borrowed a little bit from arts education for children, actually. So I should just say that. Different types of aesthetic learning. But so we grouped, so sometimes I feel like I'm talking about like a Waldorf education kind of approach. I'm a little self-conscious about it. But anyway, so we grouped the drawings into different categories of similarity, which is kind of like an archival practice. And then we had those groups of dancers dance the material. And the same groups that had similar affects in the drawing had also similar affects in their dancing. And so there starts to be this kind of like neuronal patterning that starts to like emerge through an interdisciplinary practice of learning movement. So I believe very much in transmission through the body and embodied experience, but I also have been finding that working with archival material as a mode of learning movement can actually assist with that embodied intelligence. So
there is a problem, though, in that the notion of putting like drawings together as an archival practice is not an archival practice at all. Archival practice is based on original order, which is however it was given to you. There's an assumption that that's the order that it has to stay in. An example to bring this home. So we have the David Wojnarowicz photographs of Peter Hujar on his deathbed. You know, Peter has just died. David takes a series of photographs of him, of which 4 of them are printed and he displays. And we have a box full of photographs, many prints of these, and there's a print of a leg on a hospital bed. And we had a curator displayed it in an exhibition, and somebody who knew that work and knew David pointed out that it's not Peter's leg. And yet it's on a hospital bed, and it's, you know, it looks like an homage to Peter's photography. Turns out it's Kiki Smith's leg. But it was in the box with the Hujar photographs. We have no idea when that happened, or if David did it, which he might have. Maybe he was thinking of bringing together the works that he had done that were an homage to Peter, because clearly those photographs they're very much in Peter's style. They're much tighter than David's style. We have to leave that photograph in that folder because that's where we found it. Even though we know now, and we've annotated that, in fact, this is not Peter Hujar. It has no hair on it. It should have been obvious, but nobody was thinking about it. They were just assuming, oh, the archive must be right. Well, no, it's wrong. But that's a telling example of why original order is the mantra of archiving, but it's also sometimes dangerous and slippery.
yeah, and I'll just qualify by saying that I actually my archive experience does not come from a library science background. So I am absolutely adding creative practice to my way of working with archive, but I'm actually grateful for that. So,
well, and all archival practice is subjective. I mean, that's which we mentioned before. But yeah, but we try to be as honest to the way things come in as possible. Because we don't know. Maybe David was planning something else, and somebody in 50 years will be able to ascertain why the Kiki Smith photograph is in with the Peter Hujar death photos.
I think something too that we're certainly dealing with internally is video documentation, and how, you know, both photography, film, and video of performance, and particularly with new commissions with younger artists, how we deal with that, and sort of how present the filmmaker or the photographer is and what that looks like. And so that's a creative practice as well, and I'm curious how you think about that. And certainly artists have built, you know, whole practices on photographing or filming performance and have called it, you know, their own work.
And we have Charles Atlas in the room too. So maybe, Charlie, do you want to say something about artists and filmmakers who are working with choreographers? You know, in terms of video documentation and a lot of things, it's like some kind of a traces that they're leaving. We know a lot about Cunningham and Michael Clark. Also, thank you to your films.
Well, I don't call everything that I've ever filmed a piece or a work, or there are different levels of work that I've done. And, you know, with Merce Cunningham, we collaborated on many pieces, starting from scratch, making a film, ending up as a film, and then he would transfer the material to the stage after that. And I then also, in the later period, I made some documents of his work that were, you know, made during a private performance on a stage, but we couldn't really change the choreography to make it work for the film. So I just did the best I could to make something viewable based on the dance, and I picked the dances that I thought were the most appropriate for that. I mean, there were some that I thought wouldn't work at all as a, I mean, just a wide shot is about as good as you could get, because it would, the rest of it would really not serve the dance. And then I've done, well, in my recent work with live, when I worked with Mika Tajima, we've done the document is part of the work itself. So we have performances going. We have 3 cameras. I'm doing live mixing. The audience is watching the performance and the mix. And then there's the result, which has a lot of footage, which I give it all to Mika, and I take it, and then we make our separate edits of it. So we could put it back together again, you know, in a different way, but we've never been, there's so much material out of it that we haven't ever done that part of the project.
I see it's 8:30, and I mean, I have other questions in mind, but maybe we should just continue with the wine and the food. And thank you very much for being here, and thank you to our speakers and all who helped. Thank you.